Okay, we're now on chapter 4 of Abel's Island. Haven't really added any characters. In fact, some of the characters don't seem to be in the story. Right now we just have one character. Sometimes when readers talk about books, they talk about who the narrator is. And sometimes it's what we call a first-person narrator, which is when you read a book in which the person is saying I, and it's about the person who is telling the story is the subject of the story. But in this case, we're hearing about Abel, so this is actually told in the third person. And we don't really know why the author knows so much about Abel, but we actually, and this is not a first grade thing, but what the heck, we call a narrator like this the omniscient narrator, and omniscient means all-knowing. So for some reason, this narrator knows all of these things about Abel, even though Abel is all by himself. And the setting, of course, has changed. At the beginning of the story, Abel and Amanda were on a picnic in the forest near their home, near a river, but now Abel is finding that he's on an island somewhere, and he doesn't really know very much about the setting. And in terms of when, it seems that at least a day has passed, and also the storm has passed. What is the problem? Or what are the problems? Do you have any idea how they might get solved? Or maybe one problem might get solved and another problem might arise. Chapter 4. Abel awoke early in the morning, a new mouse after his second spell of healing slumber. Stretching felt good. It struck him that his landscape had changed. There were trees in his vicinity all around him. So, vicinity, near him, all around him. His boat had been stopped by a towering one near the river's edge. Looking below, he saw that his tree towered not only because it was tall, but because it stood on a rocky prominence. The water had returned to its proper level. In many places the grass was flattened, half buried in silt and gravel. Otherwise it seemed a normal world. He climbed to the very top of his tree and made a survey. He was indeed on an island. He could see the waterfall and river above. He was on one side of the island by one fork of the river, and through the trees he could make out the fork on the opposite side. Way below he could see where the two forks rejoined. No one was anywhere visible. It was time to be getting home. He started descending the birch, and in another moment he was grinning like an idiot. He was climbing down a tree he had never climbed up. Amanda would enjoy hearing about this. She had a sense of humor almost as sharp as his. How good to be standing on solid earth again. He did some quick knee bends and ran around the tree just for the joy of the free movement. Then he sat on a stone, his elbows on his knees, and looked up and down the river. Perhaps by now they had managed to figure out what had happened to him and would be turning up in a boat or something, after all. He waited, and to keep himself amused, he hummed snatches of his favorite cantata and imagined how he would narrate his adventures. So he's thinking about, like, we're retelling the story, but he's thinking about how he's going to tell the story to other people. I wonder how you're thinking you're going to tell the story of what's happening in your life right now to other people, because people are going to be asking you in the future to tell about this time. He would be quite matter-of-fact, especially about the parts where he had shown courage and endurance. He would leave the staring and gasping to his audience. No one turned up, and Abel realized he'd been expecting too much. They'd never look for him here. Well, he would have to cross the river one way or another. He ran to the other side of the island. Perhaps the river was narrower there. It was wider. He ran back. He removed his shoes and socks, rolled up his trousers, and waded into the water to try the current. No, it would be impossible to reach the far shore by swimming, even though he was a competent swimmer. The rush of water was much too strong. He'd be dashed against a rock or dragged under and drowned. He needed a boat of some sort. How about his board and nail? Perhaps he could do something with that. He climbed his tree, dislodged the board, and followed it down when it fell to the ground. He stood over it, muttering to himself, thoughtfully fingering a filament of his mustache. I'm going to stopping whenever I come to a word that I'm thinking that you might not know. This book has a lot of, I think, unusual vocabulary, and that's part of the reasons why I like it. Most of the words that are unusual, such as filament, are not words that you have to understand in order to understand what's going on. And when I read books that are tricky for me, especially I was in a Spanish reading club, and we would only read books in Spanish. If I stopped every time there was a word that I didn't know, I would be stopping all the time, and I would lose the thread of the narrative. I would forget what was going on. So long as I had a pretty good sense, I would keep going. And part of reading, and I think most of you are gathering this, part of reading is stopping to make sure you understand, and if there's a new word, maybe learning it, and we've talked about that a lot, but also sometimes you figure out words from context, and sometimes you just keep going. So we're going to try to strike that balance now, and I'm just going to keep going. How could he not, but if you do want to find out what filament means, do ask your grown-up, and you can look it up together, and maybe you can add, maybe while I'm reading, if there's a vocabulary word that you didn't know, if this is interesting to you, you could write some of them down and then try to learn what they mean. And you can tell me when we see each other again. How could he navigate this crude piece of wood? With a rudder. If he held the rudder at an acute angle, the boat would gradually work its way to the opposite shore. That would be bending the power of the stream to his own ends. So he's kind of like a little engineer. He's trying to make this raft so that he can steer it. With a stick, he scratched a diagram in the sand. It was a long rectangle, the river, crossed by a long diagonal, the course his boat would take. Sort of picturing the river as this long rectangle. And he's thinking that his raft is going to kind of go diagonally. It's not going to go straight across because the current is moving too. So he'll be moving with the current. He should eventually land on the other side, much further downstream. He was pleased with the way his mind was working. He managed to tear a flat strip of wood from a nearby log, and with his pearl-handled penknife whittled a shapely handle. The nail would help him keep the rudder firmly in position. Now he put on his shoes and socks, arranged his clothes as neatly as he could, and edged his boat into the water. It was really much too long since he'd seen Amanda. Since their wedding, they had not been apart for as much as a day. He got aboard, pushed off from the shore with his rudder, and quickly braced it against the nail, holding the handle firmly in his paws. The rudder worked. He was moving away from the bank. Then the boat reached the powerful current further out. It began to bobble and buck. Abel's rudder shuddered in his paws, though he used all his strength to hold it steady. His knees bobbled and bucked with the boat as it sped along, snaking its way in the writhing grooves of the stream. It pitched left, then right. Then the rudder was wrenched from his grasp. And now he was no longer a helmsman, but a stunned passenger on a bit of flotsam at the mercy of the rampaging water. His boat skedaddled up to a rock, hit it catty-cornered and spun, and Abel was suddenly in the water without his boat, borne along like a limp rag. By good fortune, instead of being carried past the island and down the river, he was able to catch hold of a low-hanging streamer of weeping willow and pull himself ashore. The whole ordeal had lasted just a minute. He ambled back to his starting point near the cherry birch, his toes turned awkwardly in. The mess of wet clothes he wore added to his sense of ineptitude and shame. He was used to his clothes being dry and pressed. Where had he erred, he wondered? He should have bound the rudder to the nail, of course. He'd been too hasty in his preparations, and he had underestimated the force of the rapids. He would have to design and build a real boat, not a raft like the piece of board that had just quit his company. Perhaps it should be a sailboat. His jacket might serve as a sail. The rudder this time would be firmly secured through a hole in the stern. The sailboat so clearly envisioned, some confidence returned. He felt a bit proud, even in his wet pants. He found a piece of driftwood, somewhat disgusting since it had been gnawed and bored and channeled by lower forms of life. But he couldn't afford to be overly sensitive now. He dragged the driftwood to the edge of the water. It would be the bottom of his boat. He washed his paws. Next he peeled 3 large sections of bark from a dead tree and shaped them for the sides by bending and breaking them on the straight edge of a rock. He collected a great deal of tough grass and fashioned lengths of rope by tying the ends together. When he thought he had enough of this rope, he began cutting grooves in the driftwood. It was slow work with his small penknife. Not thinking, he fell to using his teeth. What? He drew back for a moment in revulsion. So he felt kind of disgusted with himself for doing that, because he's obviously a very sophisticated mouse, and this is not the kind of thing he does with his teeth, unlike, what did he call them? The lower forms of life. Then he continued to gnaw away. He had never before gnawed on anything but food, but the grooves were done in no time, and he didn't honestly mind the taste of the somewhat decayed wood. I think he might be learning something there. He fitted the bark into the grooves and then went to work lashing everything together, going round and round with the rope and over and under until his boat could hardly be seen for what it really was under all the lashings. Now he gathered a heap of soft grass, and with stone and stick for hammer and chisel, tamped it into all the crevices to prevent leakage. He was pleased with his ingenuity. I love that word, ingenuity. It means like inventiveness and smart ideas. He had never built a boat before. In fact, though he was a married mouse, he had never built anything or done a day's work. However, he had watched others working, so ideas came to him rapidly. I'm getting more of an idea of what kind of a character he is. What do you think he's like? When he finished his caulking, he made a mast with a crosspiece, or boom, out of branches. The mast was inserted among the numerous lashings and fastened with more. He made a rudder like the first, put it through a hole in the stern as he had planned, and surveyed the completed boat. Considering the crude materials and the lack of tools, he had to admit it was a fine piece of work. Too bad the bright day was his only witness. Before dressing the mast with his jacket, where it hung like a scarecrow's slack raiment, he removed from the inner pocket Amanda's scarf, the bit of beloved gauze that accounted for his being where he was. Remember, he left the cave where he was safe in order to rescue her scarf. I wonder how he feels about that now. He kissed the piece of fluff and tucked it inside his shirt. A favorable breeze was drifting across the island toward the shore opposite. It seemed a good omen. He looked back in a farewell glance at this remote part of the world's geography that had given him shelter for 2 nights. Then he shoved his ship into the water and leaped aboard, grabbing the tail of his coat with one paw, the rudder with the other. Boat number 2 fared worse than the first. The stream was too swift and the breeze too light for the sail to be effective. The boat swung around despite the rudder, hit a rock, and shattered. Luckily, Abel was pitched into a pebbled shallow and managed to scramble ashore, where he stood and watched his jacket and the wreck of his ship go the way of the river. Wringing his clothes